There's this person you haven't spoken to in years, maybe even a decade or more, and yet somehow they still occupy this sacred corner of your mind. You could be in a perfectly good relationship, living a completely different life, and then a song comes on, or you drive past a place you used to go together, or you see someone who looks like them from behind, and suddenly you're 17 again, feeling that specific ache that only they seem to trigger. You've probably told yourself 1,000 times that you're over it, that it was just young love, that you've moved on, but then why does their name still make your heart skip? Why do you still wonder what could have been if things had gone differently? And here's the really confusing part. You might not even want them back. You might be genuinely happy with your life, but there's this ghost of them that just won't leave. This unfinished feeling that lingers no matter how much time passes or how many other relationships you have. If you've never fully gotten over your first love, you're not being dramatic or pathetic or stuck in the past. Something very specific is happening in your brain, and once you understand what it is, the whole experience starts to make a lot more sense. Let me tell you what your first love actually represents psychologically, because it's not really about that person as much as you might think. Your first love happened during one of the most neurologically intense periods of your life. Your adolescent brain was literally rewiring itself, forming new neural pathways, experiencing emotions with an intensity you'll probably never feel again because your prefrontal cortex, the part that regulates and moderates feelings, wasn't fully developed yet. When you fell in love for the first time, you felt everything at maximum volume. Every touch was electric. Every conversation felt cosmically significant. Every moment together felt like the entire universe had arranged itself just for you. 2. And your brain, in its heightened neuroplasticity, was encoding these experiences deep into your neural architecture, creating memories that have a different quality than almost anything else you'll experience in your adult life. But here's what makes first love especially powerful. It happened before you learned to protect yourself. You loved that person with a kind of reckless vulnerability that you'll probably never replicate because you didn't know yet that love could hurt you. You didn't have walls up or defense mechanisms in place. You didn't know to be careful with your heart. You just loved fully and completely, without the cynicism or caution that comes from being hurt before. And that kind of pure, unguarded love creates a template in your brain for what love is supposed to feel like. Every relationship after that gets unconsciously compared to that intensity, and often they fall short, not because they're actually worse, but because your current brain is fundamentally different from your teenage brain. You're never going to feel feelings with that same unfiltered intensity again, not because you've lost the capacity for love, but because your neural development has moved past that stage. There's also something called the reminiscence bump that psychologists have studied extensively. Basically, memories formed between the ages of about 15 and 25 have a special staying power in our brains. They're more vivid, more emotionally charged, more central to our sense of identity than memories formed in other periods of our lives. This is the time when you're figuring out who you are, forming your identity, having your first experiences of independence and autonomy and deep connection outside your family. So your first love isn't just a relationship, it's tied up with your entire coming-of-age story, your first taste of freedom, your first real experiences of desire and intimacy and heartbreak. When you remember them, you're not just remembering a person, you're remembering who you were becoming, what the world felt like when everything was still new and possible. And here's where it gets really interesting from a psychological standpoint. If that relationship ended badly, if there was no closure, if it was sudden or confusing, or you never really got to process it properly, your brain has a hard time filing it away in the completed section of your memory. There's something called the Zeigarnik effect, which is this principle that our brains are much better at remembering unfinished tasks than completed ones. When something has resolution and closure, your brain can let it go. But when something feels incomplete, when there are unanswered questions or unresolved feelings, your brain keeps it in active memory, constantly processing it in the background, trying to make sense of it, trying to find resolution. So if your first love ended without real closure, if you never got to say what you needed to say, or understand why it ended or process the grief fully, part of your brain is still trying to finish that story. That's why they keep showing up in your thoughts. Your brain is literally still working on it. There's also what I call the museum effect, where you've preserved your first love in amber. Because the relationship ended, it never had the chance to become mundane or disappointing or complicated in the way that long-term relationships inevitably do. You never saw them get old or sick, never thought about whose family to visit for holidays, never dealt with financial stress or different parenting styles or the thousands of tiny conflicts that wear down the romance in long partnerships. They exist in your memory, as they were in those perfect moments, frozen in time, forever young and exciting and full of possibility, and you compare them not to who they probably became, but to this idealized version you've constructed over years of nostalgia. Of course, no current partner can compete with that. They're real, with real flaws and bad moods and morning breath. Your first love is a fantasy at this point, and fantasies always win against reality. But let me tell you what you're actually mourning when you can't let go of your first love, because I don't think it's really them. I think it's who you were when you were with them, that version of yourself who didn't know heartbreak yet, who believed in forever, who could feel things so intensely without fear or reservation. You're grieving your own innocence, your own capacity for that kind of pure feeling, and that's a legitimate loss. You can't go back to being that unguarded. You can't unknow what you now know about how relationships can end, how people can hurt you, how love doesn't actually conquer all. Part of getting over your first love is accepting that you can't return to that version of yourself, and that's okay. That's not failure. That's just what growing up means. There's also a really important distinction to make here between missing the person and missing the feeling. Your brain is wired to seek out peak emotional experiences. Those intense highs you felt with your first love created powerful dopamine responses, and your brain, always chasing that neurochemical reward, keeps returning to those memories as a reference point for what love should feel like. But mature love, healthy love, doesn't actually feel like that constant roller coaster of intensity. It feels like safety, consistency, partnership. It's less dramatic but ultimately more nourishing. The problem is your brain sometimes interprets that stability as boredom because it's been trained to associate love with that teenage intensity. So when you find yourself thinking about your first love while you're in a stable relationship, ask yourself, do I actually want that person back, or do I just miss feeling that way? Because those are very different things. Here's something else that's crucial to understand. Holding on to your first love can also be a way of avoiding real intimacy in the present. If you're always comparing current partners to this idealized memory, if you're always holding back part of your heart because it still belongs to someone from your past, you never have to fully risk yourself in your current relationship. You never have to be completely vulnerable. It's a protection mechanism, honestly. As long as you're still attached to someone who's not available, who exists only in memory, you can't be truly hurt by someone real, but you also can't be truly loved. You're keeping yourself safe, but you're also keeping yourself lonely. So what do you actually do about this? How do you finally let go of someone who's been living in your head for years or even decades? First, you have to stop romanticizing what you had. I mean, really stop. Sit down and think about the actual relationship, not the highlight reel. Remember the fights, the incompatibilities, the reasons it didn't work out. Remember who you both were at that age, how much you've both changed and grown. Chances are, if you got back together now, you'd be completely incompatible because you're not those people anymore. The relationship you're mourning literally can't exist because the two people who created it don't exist anymore. You also need to grieve properly, which you might never have done. Give yourself permission to feel the sadness of that loss without trying to fix it or get over it or be mature about it. Write the letter you never sent. Say out loud the things you never got to say. Cry if you need to. Rage if you need to. Let yourself feel the full weight of that ending, not to wallow in it, but to finally process it and let it move through you instead of staying stuck. Grief doesn't have an expiration date. If you never properly mourned that relationship, your psyche is still holding on to it, waiting for permission to let it go. And then, this is the hardest part, you have to make a conscious choice to invest in your present instead of your past. Every time you find yourself drifting into memories of them, gently redirect your attention to what's actually in front of you. Not as a way of denying those feelings, but as a practice of choosing where you put your emotional energy. Because here's the truth, you can spend the rest of your life wondering what if, or you can build something real with the actual people in your actual life. Both options are available to you, but you can't do both simultaneously. Your first love will probably always hold a special place in your heart, and that's okay. They were significant. They taught you what love could feel like. They were part of your becoming, but they don't have to be the standard against which everything else is measured. They can just be a beautiful chapter in your story, complete and finished, something you remember with fondness, but not longing. You can honor what you had without letting it hold you hostage. You can acknowledge that it mattered while also recognizing that it's over, and that over doesn't mean it was a failure. It just means it was what it was for the time that it was. The person you were when you loved them them is still part of you, but you're not only that person anymore. You've grown, you've learned, you've become someone capable of a different kind of love, a more sustainable kind, a kind that might not have that teenage intensity, but has depth and partnership and the possibility of actually lasting. And maybe, just maybe, that's worth more than the fantasy you've been holding on to. If this hit home for you, I'd love to hear about it in the comments. And if you're still working through this, know that you're not alone in it. Subscribe if you want more deep